Welcome back to JSOF Forum. Our next panel will examine what communication paradigms are in use today. To do this, we've invited Dr. Andrew Whiskeyman. He's a JSOF Fellow and an Associate Professor at the National Defense University College of Information and Cyberspace. And he's going to be moderator of a very diverse and talented panel. Once again, all of the bios are located in your program. As we prepare to go to the panel, I'd just like to remind you to use the hashtag symbol and Q to load your questions in the chat. Reminder that all comments remain at the unclassified level. Dr. Whiskeyman, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Doug, thank you very much, and thank you to this august panel that we have to talk about communication paradigms. Just a couple things before we kick into the discussions, and I hope we generate some really good questions at the end of this and have a little bit of time to get to those. I find that to be the time that's most fruitful are the questions from the audience on the thought-provoking ideas presented by our panel members. I'm going to turn in order in a moment, give a brief introduction to themselves. As Doug mentioned, the bios are out there, and then get into the discussions. Couple housekeeping things first. To those who celebrate Happy St. Nick's Day, hope you got more than a lump of coal in your stocking, although given the vagaries of the energy market, that coal may be worth more than gold at some point. So something to keep in mind. The second thing is, to me, as we mentioned paradigms, I can't help but think of Thomas Kuhn's groundbreaking book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions from 1962, and thinking about models and thinking about how we fall into the trap of those models, how we can recognize patterns, or how we can recognize new and emerging paradigms to take advantage of it. So given that as a quick backdrop, I'm going to turn this first over to Dr. Levine, who's going to walk us through what I think is going to be a really fascinating presentation. So Dr. Levine, over to you first. Thanks.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. My name is Tim Levine. I'm Distinguished Professor and Chair of Communication at UAB. And for the past 30 years or so, I have been doing research on human-to-human deception. I'm the author of a book titled Duped, Truth-Fault Theory, and the Social Science of Lying and Deception. And today the paradigm I'll be talking about is how TDT understands human communication. Besides doing research and chairing an academic department, I teach the Intro Basic Human class. I teach in persuasion. I teach quantitative research methods, among other things. But let's talk a little bit about the role of communication at the most broad level in human life. Our focus today will be mostly on strategic influence, but communication does a lot more for us besides just influence. And understanding how communication works requires understanding the centrality of communication in all human endeavors and how we involve. There are at least three important things that communication does for us. First, it lets us store and pass along knowledge. So virtually all technology that humans have developed have come from our ability to pass along knowledge to other people. The whole point of being here today is to learn from other people. And our ability to not have to discover everything from ourselves is absolutely central to who we are as humans. Second, communication lets us work together as teams and do things that we can't accomplish individually. And third, communication lets us form meaningful and important social and personal relationships. I put it to you that all three of these require that at a very basic level, we have to take communication for granted. If we stopped and questioned everything that we heard and read, we would absolutely be bogged down in uncertainty, and we would be paralyzed, and communication would lose its functionality. So the basic premise of truth default theory is that honesty is the default mode of communication. People are honest unless they have, except for a few pathological liars, people are honest unless they have a reason not to be. And people believe other people and take people at face value unless they have a reason not to. And of course, we know that false information exists. We know that deception exists. But most communication by most people, most of the time is honest. And most people, the idea that communication might not be honest has to be kind of actively triggered or brought to mind. And this defaulting to the truth is supremely adaptive for humans. It lets us pass along knowledge. It lets us work together. It lets us form meaningful social relationships. While deception can happen, again, most of the people are honest most of the time. Most deception also is accomplished by a few prolific liars. So for the past decade or so, I've been studying how often people lie. And the distribution of lying, like the distribution of all bad behavior in societies, is highly skewed. So most people are pretty honest most of the time. There's a few people out there that tell the vast majority of all lies. And there's also situations where we need to be more on guard for deception. Truth default theory is unique among deception theories in that it rejects what I would call Q theories, or the idea that we can detect deception by verbal or nonverbal cues. How people come off verbally, how they present, very much affects who we're going to believe and how honest and authentic we're going to perceive people. But it's almost completely unrelated to whether you should believe them or not. Instead, the focus is on listening to content understood in context. And truth default theory provides us with 5 ways for improved lie detection. But that's a talk for a different day. In closing, I would like to leave you with the idea of triggers and trigger moderators. So when we're communicating with other people, whether the information is true or false, honest or deceptive, usually doesn't come to mind unless something brings it to mind, makes us suspicious. And I think of these triggers as being of 2 types. The first gets us out of our truth default and into considering the possibility that something might not be totally accurate or honest. And then the second, once we consider that, leads to the conscious decision that I shouldn't believe this. So the first trigger is suspicion, skepticism. The second leads us to an active conscious judgment of falsity or ascribed deceptive intent. In the modern information environment, I think there are 3 things that moderate these the sensitivity of these triggers to whether we become suspicious or not. And these are, how does the information align with our own beliefs? I call this belief congruence. This is very much in line with dissonance theory or confirmation bias. If information aligns with what we already believe, if the source is preaching to the choir, we're much more likely not to question it and take it at face value than if we disagree with what's being communicated. The second I call social congruence, and that is how the information being communicated aligns with what those around me believe. And if the message aligns with what my friends, family, coworkers all think, then I'm much more likely to believe it. And third, I call message ubiquity or message persistence. So it's just how often you hear something. If you hear something over and over again, you're more likely to believe it. My thesis is that if the information aligns with what you already believe, it aligns with what people around you in your important social reference groups believe, and if you hear it over and over again, you're almost certain to believe it, regardless of truth and falsity. Thank you.
Hey, Dr. Levine, thank you. You really unpacked a very dense subject very succinctly. That's amazing. Of course, that's the root word of being a doctor, right? Is being able to teach and take the complex and put it into terms that the pedestrians of us are able to understand. I think we could probably have taken that talk and spent a whole semester or longer on it. And hopefully it generates some great questions. Tough act to follow, but follow nonetheless. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Allen, you are up next.
Yeah, many apologies. My camera has just dropped out. I think it's struggling to get across the Atlantic at the moment. Good morning, everyone, or as it is here, good afternoon. As you've seen from my bio, I've served across the British Army for about 36 years now in a wide range of general and specialist roles with a particular focus on influence and irregular activity. It is, of course, a vibrant debate as to whether the nature of war does not change, as Clausewitz says, or has fundamentally shifted. However, as we can see from present events, war does remain violent, competitive, and chaotic. The character of warfare, however, is seemingly changing rapidly, driven by the pace and pervasiveness of information and technological change. Distinction between public and private, foreign and domestic, state and non-state, and virtual and physical are increasingly blurred, often deliberately so. Whilst in many ways that's always been somewhat true, it's definitely become starker. The current strategic context is as complex, dynamic, and competitive as it's ever been. Pervasive instability defines the environment and is challenged by those who seek to transgress the rules-based international order, test national resilience, and exploit the lack of seams in a global and interconnected world. In this scenario, we should seek to prevent unintentional escalation through an effective deterrence and response posture that utilizes all the levers of power, including the military. Central to such a posture is information and its communication. All levels of this integrated activity should understand the common narrative that is continuously reinforces this strategy. Unclear outcomes, objectives, actions, words, or apparent discrepancies and contradictions may signal the policy position is not firm, and blurring red lines too far may increase the likelihood of uncontrolled escalation. Vague or unclear narratives also increase the likelihood of confusion, misinterpretation, and potentially unintentional escalation. With that in mind, what communication paradigms do we need to be cognizant of when we communicate such a narrative, and how have they changed? Clearly, there have been many trends in recent years, but in these remarks, I'll briefly highlight 4 interlinked points. First, there's been a shift from broadcasts through narrowcasts to pointcasts, as data-trained artificial intelligence and open source intelligence has segmented audiences in a more precise way than ever. This has enabled precision information at reach in a way never previously possible. You can see how Bellingcat was able to identify Russian military personnel from the main computation center of the General Staff, the GVC, involved in the targeting of cruise missiles down to their addresses and cell phone numbers. This was achieved through generally open sources using investigative journalism techniques. Second, delivery platform has been shown to be less important than a credible voice. A credible brand can seamlessly move across platforms and dimensions and retains unprecedented resilience in communication. An authentic voice, whatever that may be in context, will always be a primary aim. The platforms themselves are increasingly less important than the voice that is used across them. Credible platforms can rapidly lose credibility in a fast-moving commercial, competitive environment. Communications, therefore, need to be credible across all platforms, not just within the bounds of a platform that is often beyond our control. Third, the abundance of information has created a complicated information environment that privileges access over distribution. Individuals are far more enabled to select and define their own information ecosystems and will choose access over information to widespread distribution. This reinforces a greater need for precision in understanding of our audiences to the micro level, or credibility will be undermined. It is increasingly necessary to segment audiences at this micro level to achieve authenticity and credibility in messaging. Finally, in link to a previous point, platforms and audiences are far more adept at identifying inauthentic behaviors. This creates ever greater challenges for those seeking to obscure the ultimate source of an authentic voice they may try to use. Whilst of limited consequence to overt communications campaigns is a challenge to less direct communication vectors. This creates an increasingly adversarial operating environment, not only with the target audience, but often with the platforms themselves. This presents a challenge to broad-based communication strategies in their ability to deliver a consistent narrative across all activities. The current security environment presents challenges of scale and speed that are routinely deliberately obscured and obfuscated as part of a strategy to achieve objectives short of violent conflict. Consistent and authentic communication is a key part of controlling escalation and delivering deterrence, as well as delivering a desired effect. The evolving communication paradigms can present both a threat and an opportunity to the strategic communication of narratives. Navigating through that presents security professionals with a significant challenge. And back to you, Andrew.
Hey, Dave, thanks. And a second brilliant act. We're getting ready to tee up number 3 in the batting order here. I would use a World Cup analogy. Go England in this case, Dave. Hope that all fares well. But I'm fascinated as we get to the questions to see those threads in particular, as you've seen in the audience, how this is talked about, that truth default theory, and now the precision of the precision in messaging, but still that trust that's underlying both of those arguments. We'll see if that thread of trust in communications stays through, if we get a divergent thought on that. But in particular, as warfighters, how we think through that process and the professional nature of having to be involved in information, not as an afterthought, but as a forethought. So with those two base runners on, we're on to, let's see who's up next. Col Bryan Picket, you're up next.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. So as background, I am an Air Force information officer with over 21 years in service, 14 of those in information operations. As background, I have worked in the staff, primarily across different MAGCOMs, at the headquarters Air Force and in the joint staff, including at Indo-PACOM. Currently, I am serving as the Deputy Director at the Joint MISO WebOps Center. And so as part of that, I'm going to focus a lot of my comments towards online communications in the digital environment and how it applies to the fourth age of SOF. And happily enough, a lot of what Dave said is actually a good prelude into the discussion points that I was going to highlight. So thank you very much, Dave, for that. So it will come as no surprise to anyone. However, the digital environment is continuing to increase in the importance, the scale, and the scope, impacting all aspects of our lives. However, the digital world and the way we communicate within that world continues to evolve over time. And I'm only going to address 3 specific aspects of that. Like I said, a couple of those hinted at by Dave. First of all, in the digital space, people have moved from being an audience to a user. So broadcast media no longer consists of just a few limited broadcast platforms that dominate and control the information environment and providing only a singular world picture that most people accept as common and true. Instead, users are able to choose from a variety of diverse sources and then self-select those data sources to conform to their own particular interests and their points of view. Second, users no longer simply consume media, but now create media. This is not a new trend. However, individual users are now creating news in and of itself, which is then picked up by the news channels in a reversal of what the traditional structure has typically been. Third, users are faced with an overwhelming amount of information, a limited time to absorb this information, and often a lack of digital and media literacy. Unfortunately, our adversaries and malign actors understand these trends and deliberately manipulate the information to their own advantage. Disinformation can create issues with elections, governance, leading to an overall distrust in traditional media and the government. Adversaries continue to exploit technology to increase the spread of disinformation through technologies such as bots and artificial intelligence. Additionally, the new compound security environment provides a wide variety of issues that malign actors can exploit in order to be able to create those grievances and divisions. So in this environment, it is more important than ever that the DoD as a whole, as well as our SOF MISO professionals, understand this trend, engage the adversary in the digital and social media sphere, and understand and increase our capacity, reach, and permissions. Therefore, a persistent, credible online presence provides multiple benefits that will enable the fourth age of SOF. First of all, it provides sensors in the information environment to act as a screening role for indicators and warnings of adversary intent, actions, narratives, and potential audience grievances. Second, it provides a low visibility, forward deployed small footprint that can utilize cross-cultural competence to work with the indigenous populations in order to be able to build trust and bolster resiliency in those populations. Finally, and perhaps more interestingly, it allows for the digital preparation of the environment to build a latent UW capability that can either provide a deterrent effect in strategic competition or resistance early in a conflict, while also providing a channel for exposing and combating adversarial disruptive influence. It can also provide for channels to disclose information in a credible way. Overall, this unique access and placement provides options for remote geostrategic, positional, and information advantage for a campaign of influence. And with that, I will concede the rest of the time over to the panel so that we might get to questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Hey, no, Brian, thanks. A couple things as we continue the thread on trust, placement, what the digital age means to that trust default theory, how you build that over time. A whole lot of things kind of coming together of key points of overlap that I'm seeing. We've got a couple of questions teed up already, which we'll get to at the end, but that's good. Keep your questions coming if you have them as we go, and then we'll work through it. And with that, back and forth with bases loaded. Mr. Farris, over to you.
Thanks. I wasn't sure if we were following baseball or soccer analogies, but thank you for dialing in.
It's an international crowd. Go with either one. So
Thanks.
Baseball's on my heart because my Phillies made it to the World Series this year, which is like lightning striking twice sometimes, unless you live in Tampa Bay, who's got a host of championship series. But anyway, pick the sport.
I like it. We'll stick with baseball somehow. So, hey, good morning, everyone. So my name is Patrick Farris. So I'm a non-resident fellow at JSOU, but I'm also a supervisory special agent at the FBI, and I'm currently assigned to the Washington field office. Just to add one additional caveat, so all the opinions here are mine. They don't reflect anything from DOJ or the FBI, in addition to the other caveats that you've already seen. So I've been at this for about 20 years. I'm a line operations supervisor at the moment, and I've worked across many different programs, but the common thread of my career has been Russian counterintelligence. And the last several years, I've been very focused on what we would call Russian malign influence or Russian malign actors. So how I came here and into this forum, I spent the last year on sabbatical at National Defense University, right? Still working for the FBI, but basically chopped away for a year to sit back and to think about some of these problems. And where the focus of my research has been, and the key points that I want to make today to enable our further discussion, are around the importance of proxies, the value in looking at proxies and intermediaries widely and understanding them widely. And what I mean by that is, I would offer a proxy or an intermediary is literally anyone that has any level of agency. And this all ties into, again, we've heard some other speakers talk about that, the importance of authenticity. And I think, I like to describe that also as that legitimacy. How do we have these intermediaries who are passing these strategic messages, often from an adversarial country or service? And how do they achieve that authenticity and legitimacy? So one of the things that I've really been examining is how much more complex that problem has become. And I'm going to paste in just some references here that I feel are helpful in understanding and looking at specific case studies for how we see these intermediaries at work. And one of the challenges is, and again, I'll mostly speak to examples around Russia, is when we look, and one of those links that I just pasted is from State Department's Global Engagement Center, and it describes the ecosystem of Russian disinformation. I think that ecosystem model, as some other folks have already hinted at, is a very correct way to understand it. And to even build onto that is, I think we have to make this recognition of we're focused on the actors rather than the activities in a complex and changing system. And I think some of the really foundational research done by Bob Jervis and others in system effects and how we understand complex, ever-changing systems, and then looking at the people and the intermediaries within them, those are the things that I would argue are worth most of our attention. And some of these examples that I pasted in there, you look at how is an adversarial service or country, how are they trying to build that authentic voice? My observation professionally and through my research has been that people are really still at the heart of this, and how you layer those people in and how you blend those people in and how you tie those people in to make them a legitimate, authentic voice, and then the value that can have in pushing forward a message. Those are all truly, truly important things where I would offer much of our focus needs to be on, again, like how this gets layered in interesting and complex ways to where someone becomes well-regarded and all of a sudden they have an audience. Again, this is pasted in the examples, but I think how we measure and evaluate that and how we assess, oftentimes, for my service and my home agency, the challenge is how are we assessing the threat or the risk posed by that? And I think that's an area where there's really a need for further research and discussion, and that it's so hard to pin that down. And I think Ben Nemo at Graphica has done some very interesting things with his breakout scale. And again, building on previous speakers, where we talk about when someone has a message and then it starts to go across platforms or it obtains that legitimacy and people pick it up as truth and then starts to carry on. Those are all challenging things, but we still have, I think, and there's room for a lot of healthy discussion on, well, how big an impact is that really? What effect does it really have? And again, this is where I make the argument for the focus on the actors. We need to be peeling back and looking to identify the people that are involved in this, seeing how that message moves through oftentimes an extensive chain of intermediaries, and also recognizing too that at the end of some of these campaigns, there's a great deal of manipulation that's happening by an adversary. This isn't just someone who's picked it up on their own and is putting it out there and they think it's their original thought or their own views. Have they been manipulated, and what does that look like? And again, I would just conclude with a lot of what we've seen from the very well-studied US election interference in 2016 and 2020, those techniques are still out there, and we're still seeing the troll farms. We're still seeing all these things, but I would offer where our focus should lie and where we should really be thinking about is, what's the role of the proxies? How do they fit in? How are we examining and detecting and countering those people? So back to Dr. Whiskeyman. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Mr. Farris. And that, I think, pulls a really interesting thread as we continue that bit of people being centric to the information fight as well. Being just central to the message. It's not just the message that's going out, it's how it's being received by an audience. How is somebody an influencer? How are they trusted in that? All of these things keep building as we continue to examine the paradigms of communication, the centrality of people to that. And then really, as we think through the SOF specific aspect to it, how does that enable or hinder the mission that SOF forces have, not only today, but also going forward into the future, as we spend some time examining coming technologies and patterns of behavior, et cetera. And no stranger to patterns of behavior, having spent years in this business. A good friend of mine, Vic Garcia, over to you for your thoughts on communications paradigms.
Thanks, Andy, and thank you for this opportunity to be part of this panel today. Critically important subject to discuss. A little bit about me: Colonel, retired, 30 years in the U.S. Army. Had the opportunity to serve as the Chief of Information Operations at both U.S. Central Command and U.S. Special Operations Command. Commanded 2 IO task forces, one in Iraq and another in Qatar, and also served as an infantry deputy brigade commander in Kandahar. So I'm a longtime practitioner, and now I'm working with industry, working for a company called Peraton. Over the last 20 years, the United States has been focused its attention on combating violent extremism, and our strategic competitors have built the capacity to rival American influence around the world. They invested in the military capabilities, both kinetic and non-kinetic, allowing them to now challenge the U.S. as the partner of choice. In 2022, national security and national defense strategies are now seeking to address these challenges to American leadership of the rules-based global order, by implementing integrated deterrence. Deterrence is built by developing first-rate, cutting-edge combat power to dissuade our adversaries from violent military action, and by effectively competing for influence and legitimacy with allies and partners around the globe. Ultimately, deterrence, influence, and legitimacy are cognitive functions, and our nation requires the full complement of tools to achieve these objectives. That said, the United States faces significant challenges because, unlike during the Cold War, the responsibility for eye and dime is not owned by one single department or agency. We no longer have a U.S. information agency focused on competing for the war in the war of ideas. As one author recently stated, American information operations remains underfunded, fragmented across departments and the intelligence community, and unevenly linked to broader public diplomacy. Recently, Lieutenant General John Braga, the current USSOCOM commander, spoke of the need for effective modern-day deterrence triad consisting of space, cyber, and special operations forces to respond to irregular activity that stops short of armed conflict and, when necessary, dominates foes in those domains when a war begins. We have adaptable, creative thinking operators capable of competing in the information environment in the tradition of the Office of Strategic Services and the conduct of irregular warfare. But it requires an investment in time, people, and resources, like what we have done for JSOC. As the coordinating authority for operations in the information environment, SOCOM should take the lead to address the current misalignment in the authorities and resources for both the cognitive and technical functions of information operations and influence operations on a broader level. American strategic competitors are making those investments and have made tremendous progress in achieving influence, winning the narrative, and gaining dominance in the electromagnetic spectrum. I'd like to touch on a little bit more having to do with this idea of, communications paradigm is this misalignment of authorities and resources. So on the one hand, we have the Department of State, which has the primacy of authorities outside of theaters of hostilities. They primarily conduct public diplomacy, but this public diplomacy is disjointed and varies from embassy to embassy with no regional approach or global approach in a synchronized manner. The Global Engagement Center works under the auspices of the State Department, and they continue to build the capacity to analyze the environment and to work with partners and allies to build indigenous capacity in other parts of the globe. So it's a very useful function, but it's also strictly in an overt capacity, which is useful and plays a necessary role, but again is insufficient when we're talking about the competition of ideas. The U.S. Agency for Global Media, responsible for things like the Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, et cetera, have a large budget, approximately $700 million budget a year, but they take a very journalistic approach rather than a hardcore influence approach to the information environment. And again, operating in a purely overt manner, which is again necessary, but I would argue insufficient in this realm of competing for influence on a global scale. The intelligence community have the capacity to operate on a covert level. However, they are very focused on their influence and deception activities and are very focused on adversary strategic leadership, which brings us now to the Defense Department. So the Defense Department has the capacity to operate on both overt and clandestine levels. And when I say clandestine, I want to bring up the point that Colonel Allen brought up earlier, which is really the need for authentic voices. And so when operating in a clandestine role, there we're not using untruthful information. We're using truthful information, but we're hiding the nature of the messenger. Because anybody with children can tell you the messenger matters, and sometimes what mom and dad will tell a child will go in one ear and right out the other, but another influential adult, a coach or a teacher, can tell them the exact same thing, and that child will respond and listen to that input. So it's very much the same with foreign audiences. The influencer, the messenger matters, and sometimes when it's directly coming from the United States, particularly from the Department of Defense, that leads the message to being lost and getting tuned out. The other thing about the Department of Defense that it has as a strength is the trained cadre of influence personnel, particularly under the SOF umbrella. And but again, here they are low density, very high demand force, the PSYOP force, and even if we broaden that out to include the Army's FA-30 community, the Air Force's information professionals, there still is insufficient force structure to meet all the demands that's currently required at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels. So what I'm getting at here is that the current paradigm for conducting communications for influence perspective is insufficient. And we as a nation need to address this head on, and we need to change the current construct in terms of authorities, resources, and personnel in order to compete in a strategic environment. Thanks, Andy. Back over to you.
No, Vic, thanks. And really interesting look. We purposely left paradigm broad. And I think it's fascinating that we got to look at how it happens out in the wild, if you will, of how people fall into paradigms of communication and building trust, of how we fall into our own paradigms of our own constructs that either help or hinder us in our ability to organize to get after the problems. Absolutely fascinating. Yes, I'm going to say thanks now in case we get right to the end and I don't, but thank you all very much for really fascinating comments and insights, and love to catch up with you over name your favorite beverage, caffeinated to decaffeinated at some other point at one of these forums that we get together at. And just a foot stomp for everybody. When you look at the panel between industry, government, and academia, we need all three. This is not something that we're going to tackle on our own in our own echo chambers of excellence. It's about coming together and really wrestling with some of these things. So speaking about wrestling with some of these things, I've got a number of really good questions. I'm going to end up combining bits of a couple of them just because there's some overlap and thread between them. But the first question through, I'm going to give to Patrick and to Dave in that order to think through. And it gets to how we organize to get after this problem. Right now, it seems we're federated all over the place in terms of how we're trying to get after the challenges we face with information. How do we come together as interagency and as close allies to work together better? Or have you seen anything you can share as a best practice, perhaps, of getting after collaborating in the information space? So Patrick and then Dave.
Thanks for the question. So yeah, and I would echo that is one of the greatest challenges, particularly as the mediums themselves have evolved so quickly. So as we're trying to catch up and as government is trying to keep up with the speed of industry and of communication can be very challenging. My experience has been using so in the Bureau, we'll talk about a threat team model, which is when we basically have a problem that's so expansive or involves things that don't neatly fit in a box. We'll assemble a threat team, typically, and again, because someone sort of has to be the convener for it. And I use that word convener purposefully rather than coordinator. We don't want to necessarily coordinate everyone's operational activity or their understanding or their analysis. What we want to do is we want to be the convener to bring together all the different stakeholders that have a piece of this problem to be able to better address it. And so my experience has been, and that can be, it's akin to a task force, but again, the threat team, I think, purposefully looks at different aspects of the threat. So for example, right, in most security services, you have different divisions, but we see in this arena, a lot of these problems, they don't just neatly fit into one place. You could define it arbitrarily in 5, 10, maybe 20 different ways. So my thought is, or my recommendation and experience is assembling these threat team models, but again, purposefully recognizing the power of the convener to bring people together, to share ideas, to see what do they already have going operationally, because it can be so difficult to sequence because we're all detecting and trying to address the problem at different times. That threat team concept and using a convener, I would say, is something worth consideration.
No, thanks, Patrick. That's a good insight. Dave, how about you from Allied perspective coming together?
I mean, to be honest, I'd echo what Pat said there. Is the sort of convening authority is really important because certainly we found that it generally requires a crisis to highlight who's who in the zoo in terms of the information environment. And I think probably we found that during the pandemic. It was lots of different government organizations that suddenly had to communicate at a sort of regional, local, sort of sub-local level. And I think that a crisis forcing function is really useful in that sense. So I think that left us far better prepared come sort of recent events because a lot of the structures that had been put in place during the pandemic were used for government communications at that level. But as Patrick says, it's a convening authority rather than a coordination authority because there's lots of different organizations with lots of different permissions and ways of operating. So you sort of can tend to sort of cohere rather than coordinate. But I think it's learning from the crisis is certainly what we found. And we have a number of structures which are in place now that were designed essentially during a pandemic, but have proved to be useful. And I think it's maintaining that momentum before we dissipate back into our sort of comfortable stovepipes and sort of interagency and even some in the inter-service even rivalries. But I think a crisis sort of tends to be a forcing function, and it's the most appropriate person as the convening authority. That's not necessarily the most obvious one. So I think I would echo the same way, and I think the threat team. You react to the current threat, whatever that may be, whether that's a pandemic or whether that's activities happening to the east of us.
Right. Yeah, that power to convene is pretty important. And two shameless plugs. Thanks to JSOU, who has done just that with this forum, right? It's a power to convene to bring people together to, I hadn't met a number of you before, and this is a great way to bring that community of interest together. And I know that between the UK's government and the US, the Phoenix Challenge series is another way of bringing people together in this community of working through that. That power to convene is critical. I think we're going to have to table one as a thought, but Vic had mentioned SOCOM having a power to convene, and maybe that we don't have enough time to explore all of that here. But as takeaways from the conference, who has that power to convene to bring people together, not necessarily to coordinate, but to assist with moving out in the same direction and identifying challenges. On the identifying challenges, I'm going to pull a couple of threads for questions for Dr. Levine. You get the next one. Is based on the trust default theory, yet we have a proliferation, it seems, of misinformation and disinformation. Have you seen any ways that people are identifying that, or if it's coming within the scope of where they already trust, they're just consuming it, it becomes really hard to eradicate? Just any thoughts from you on identifying mis and disinformation and how people operate within that?
So I think the first thing to keep in mind, while I'm not sure that misinformation and disinformation is anything new. I tend to think it's false things, false ideas. Humans have always held false ideas, and they're always going to. I think the misinformation and disinformation, every content analysis I've seen suggests that it's a needle in a haystack problem. So the vast majority of information on the internet isn't false. So the trick is being skeptical when you need to be skeptical, but you can't be skeptical of everything because then, as I talked about, you bog down. So this is, of course, a huge challenge. So any kind of solution for the public is going to have to be something on how they can selectively trigger. I'll give you a great example of a place where it happens really well, is with fraudulent and phishing text messages. If you're like me, you may get 2 or 3 or 4, maybe obviously deceptive messages on your cell phone every day. I just got some winter stimulus for $4,000. If I only click this link, I can do it. To my knowledge, I've never fallen for one of these. I suspect, literally billions of these goes out. I think the success rate at detecting them is probably 99.999 something percent. But nevertheless, they make money doing it because of that tiny fraction of a percent who do fall for it. So that might be we've all learned how to recognize those. Maybe that might hold some insights.
No, thanks. I appreciate that. And I think something to a couple of things you said. I'm 100% with you. I don't think mis and disinformation are a new phenomenon. The way we receive them tends to be new, but remembering the old quote, sometimes there is nothing new under the sun in how we approach conceptualizing getting after this. But recognizing it, I think, is interesting and probably a note for either a follow-up panel or follow-up discussions. As I've been doing some reading recently on, fancy term, amazing results, psychological inoculation theory, or pre-bunking of ideas, or how do you prepare people through education to recognize those patterns that are meant to deceive them so they can be trust but verify almost, right? Be trusting, but be aware of those triggers that are oftentimes the telltale signs. I think that's a way to assist as well, and probably something for follow-up discussions. I do want to hit one last point on this, and then I'll go back to some new questions that just came in, but it gets to the resourcing, because a couple of you have hit this. And Brian, I'm going to turn this over to you for your thoughts on it with a ballpark answer. But, Vic mentioned that we're under-resourced. I know some research I've done with the Dr. Mike Berger looks at, this is just all open source stuff. Geico, for instance, twice that the US government does, and it only seeks to sell cheap car insurance. So how do we get after advocating for resources as the reality of an entity? What is a right venue for that? What sort of things do we need in aggregate to get after this? Because it's not a secondary mission. This is a primary mission that requires time, talent, and treasure to be applied to it if we want to be successful, especially when you look at the scale of what Russia and China are putting into this fight. They're either complete idiots wasting their time putting messaging out there, or they're onto something about the effectiveness of getting after communications. So, Brian, any thoughts on you in terms of resourcing?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So this is definitely a very complex issue in the fact that a lot of what we see in terms of misinformation, disinformation, and the huge impact that's having on our target audiences and within the US right now is still rarely understood by the vast majority of the US public. And it's very difficult to then quantitatively explain the difference between how much our adversaries are putting forward in terms of this capability versus how much the US is putting forward, without also getting into concerns about classification of capabilities and everything else. So if you're unable to speak to the exact nature of the problem and make people understand how much of a problem exists, then it's difficult to then invigorate the community to look for a solution on that. And then whenever you start looking into solutions, as a lot of things that Vic pulled up is very applicable here. So you've got multiple different agencies with multiple different guidelines and guidance and authorities that are then trying to apply to this problem set. So who is the appropriate agency to then ask for additional resources to combat this threat in the environment. And so I think that's where we just need to get a better understanding of being able to explain to our senior leader decision makers exactly what it is that is happening in the environment, what it is that we can bring to the table, and how we're able to integrate what we bring either from a DoD perspective in alignment with our interagency partners, with the FBI, with the GEC, with the Department of State, as well as with our allied partners from the UK, et cetera. And so it's more of a being able to lay out the strategy in a clearly articulated vision that we need to push forward to.
No, thanks, Brian. I think that's really, really important that this is a professional's business. I mean, you've heard it said that amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. The Whiskeyman corollary is that experts talk information. And so with that, Doug, if you are on, back over to you, or whoever is the host right now, as I think we're at time and getting ready to head into the lunch break. I want to make sure I gave you closing comments. But thanks to the panel, I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion and spending some time with you virtually this morning or this afternoon, Dave, in your case.
So thank you, Dr. Whiskeyman, and all the panelists. Your comment about the power to convene and bring people together to talk about these topics, I think reemphasizes why JSOU does these forums. On a particular note, Lieutenant Colonel Allen and Patrick Farris are actually members of our first class of non-resident fellows. And they've been doing a lot of things. They applied and were accepted, and they're participating in things like this, as well as other conversations on curricula and research. Applications will be opening in the next few weeks for the next class. Applications will occur, and then the second class will be recruited and then brought on board. Additionally, for Dr. Levine at the University of Alabama Birmingham, this is the first event that Dr. Levine has participated with SOCOM in, and so I'd really like to thank him. Additionally, for all of the people that wrote questions, Bashir Riot, Howard Simkin, Brian Sparling, John Markham, Frank Reedy, the list goes on and on. The nature of this is lots of good questions. The moderators are going to kind of compile them. Laura Jurgensen, Jared Fabrilia, we really appreciate, and we're going to try to encourage more interaction between you and your questions and the panelists. It's just right now it's the nature of kind of how we're conducting it. A great panel. This brings us the morning session to a close.